Today our story is about Alexander Komin, who kept slave girls in his basement. The maniac forced them to sew things to sell, but his main passion was the elaborate massacres he devised for his slave girls. Comyn also dreamed of an underground kingdom where his slave girls would bear him little slaves. Alexander Komin was born on May 24, 1953 in the town of Vyatskie Poliani, Kirov region, in a family of ordinary workers. In his childhood and youth, he did not stand out among his peers. He studied moderately and did not show any special abilities. Having barely finished 8 grades, Komyn decided to leave his studies and prepare for the army, but instead, he ended up in the bunkhouse. The 18-year-old Alexander got into a fight, in which 2 people were seriously injured, and ended up in a colony under the article hooliganism. While serving his 3-year sentence, Komyn listened with rapt attention to the stories of his cellmate, who once kept in captivity several homeless people who painted icons and pictures, and the owner sold them for good money. Komyn liked the prisoners' stories very much, and took them on a note. Meanwhile, behind bars, the young convict seemed to have found his calling. He worked at a local sewing factory, and he was very enthusiastic about his work. Once free, Komyn went to learn sewing skills at the technical school, dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. But the diploma of a fashion designer did not guarantee employment. Komyn worked as an electrician, laborer, watchman, and then got a job as a stoker. At the last place of work, Komyn met a colleague, an engineer by education, Alexander Mikheyev. Remembering the stories of a fellow slave owner, he suggested to Mikheyev that he start his own slaves, who would grow berries and vegetables for sale. As a second source of income, Komyn planned to breed black cats for hides so that he could make souvenirs out of those hides. Sometime later, Komyn's plans changed. He decided to organize a sewing factory where his personal slaves would work. The workshop was to be Alexander's personal garage in the local cooperative Ideal. However, to keep slave girls in the garage itself with good audibility was risky, so Komyn and Mikheyev decided to create a fortified basement under it, like a bunker. The work took the accomplices a long 4 years. "This will be not a greenhouse, but a dungeon," Komyn liked to say. Owners of neighboring garages sometimes noticed how Komyn carries buckets of earth and building materials, although, as a rule, accomplices tried to do it at night. But Alexander waved off curious neighbors and all questions answered. Say, "I grow cucumbers in the garage and breed nutria for sale." This legend is very fond of the wives of motorists, who often put hard-working Komyn as an example to their spouses. By the end of 1994, the bunker at a depth of 9 meters was ready. Its area was 15 square meters. A staircase led to the room divided into several rooms. To it, Komyn conducted high voltage in case his future captives thought to escape. The accomplices covered the walls with mattresses for better soundproofing. A little later, Komyn and Mikheyev installed tables and beds in the bunker, bought 2 sewing machines and fabric, and then began the search for slaves. Slave girls were sought among women leading an antisocial lifestyle. One of them, 33-year-old Vera Tolpayeva, met Alexander Mikheyev on December 11, 1994. On her own misfortune, Tolpayeva herself asked Mikheyev to give her a smoke. They got to talking. Soon Vera agreed to have a drink in the company of Alexander and went with him to the garage. After waiting for the woman to get a little tipsy, the accomplices added cloflin to her shot glass. The woman woke up in the bunker and listened with horror to the speech of Komyn and Mikheyev, who informed her that from now on, she would live in the basement and sew things. Her first reaction was to try to break out of captivity, but the forces were not equal. Afterwards, to subdue the stubborn slave, Komyn repeatedly beat her with a rubber hose and iron chains, raped her, and constantly threatened to kill her. Soon the captive was so intimidated that she agreed to all the conditions. But she could not sew. No matter how much Komyn taught Tolpayeva to work on the machine, nothing good came out. Then Alexander demanded that Vera recommended as a slave someone of his acquaintances, and Tolpayeva said that her 35-year-old friend was engaged in sewing. She gave the acquaintance's address as well. Komyn went there in January 1995 and suddenly ran into one of his former cellmates, Nikolai Malik. Coincidentally, he turned out to be Melnikova's roommate. Komyn offered Nikolai a drink for a meeting in his garage, and he agreed, taking his girlfriend with him. Together with Mikheev, Komyn got the guests drunk with vodka with clofulin, after which Tatiana Melnikova was lowered into the bunker. Her lover they considered too dangerous to leave alive. Nikolai stripped down to his underwear and took him to the nearest field. His clothes were scattered nearby to make it look like he undressed himself in a state of psychosis and fell asleep in a snowdrift. The man's stiffened body was stumbled upon a few days later by passers-by, who reported the discovery to the police. Komyn's idea worked. The police were not interested in the death of Malik, who had always had a taste for alcohol, and wrote it off as an accident. Meanwhile, Komyn was working Melnikova according to the old scheme. The woman, tormented by abuse, soon broke down and began sewing bathrobes and underwear. She had to work 16 hours a day. The master demanded 32 robes a day. The second prisoner, Tolpayeva, was busy setting up the bunker. In case of disobedience, Komyn promised to cut both slave girls with a knife. Komyn practically did not feed his captives. Their diet consisted mainly of cereals, potatoes, black bread, and rosehip infusion. To survive, Tolpayeva and Melnikova often had to fry potato peelings. The slave women washed once a week in a basin. For this purpose, Komyn used a winch to lower a canister of water into the cellar. Meanwhile, the clothes that Melnikova sewed were in great demand in the local market. And then Komyn and Mikheev decided to expand production, but for this they needed male power. And then the captives themselves offered to bring to the bunker their old acquaintance, who drank a lot, lost his home, and was happy to any shelter. Komyn received a detailed description of his appearance and went to look for a potential slave at the local market. But he made a mistake and brought another man to the garage. So, 37-year-old Evgeny Shishov appeared in the bunker. The man had a strong physique, served in the airborne forces, but then became addicted to alcohol and gave up a lot. He went down into the bunker himself. Komyn convinced him that he would pay him well for his help. Finding himself trapped, Shishov agreed to put on shackles, and at the same time said that he was a skilled electrician. He didn't even think that with this revelation, he was signing his own death warrant. Komyn immediately realized that the prisoner would easily cut off the power to the latter, and planned to get rid of Shishov by executing him in a homemade electric chair. The maniac tied the prisoner to the chair, let him smoke his last cigarette, wrapped bare wires around his arm and leg, and ordered his female captives to press the buttons attached to the device switches. Melnikova, even on pain of death, refused to comply with the demand, but Tolpayeva carried out Komyn's order. Yevgeny Shishov died instantly from a powerful electric shock. Komyn severely beat Melnikova, who disobeyed him, and Tolpayeva, on the contrary, became his favorite. He even let Vera go free to find and bring a new victim to the garage. The woman on whose conscience was the death of Shishov, finding herself at large, not only did not go to the police, but clearly followed the orders of Komyn. July 16, 1995. Tolpayeva returned to the garage in the company of 36-year-old unemployed Tatiana Kozikova. She had recently been released from the colony, where she served time for petty theft, and before that, worked as a cook. Once in the bunker, Kozikova, like the other prisoners, was beaten, but this did not break her will. She constantly tried to resist and even defended her friend in misfortune, Tatiana Melnikova. Kozikova made her a homemade amulet, a note wrapped in polyethylene with a prayer, and when she learned that Melnikova, tormented by slavery, was thinking of settling the score with her life, Kozikova talked her out of the fatal step, promising that she would organize an escape. The prisoner kept her word. Having found out that Komyn de-energizes the stairs when he himself descends into the bunker, Kozakova took a moment and locked him in one of the rooms, and together with her friend tried to escape. But Komyn broke down the door and grabbed the women climbing the stairs. A terrible punishment awaited them. To such an extent he beat me that I was covered in blood myself. Blood spatter, my skin was bursting. Then he took a hose, then he twisted my head. Then he lit my hands on fire with a candle, recalled one of the slaves. But these cruel tortures seemed not enough to the furious Komyn. He offered Kozakova and Melnikova a punishment of their choice, either to cut their mouths from ear to ear or to tattoo the word slave on their foreheads. The frightened captives chose the second option, and the maniac mutilated their faces with tattoos, in addition to the word on their foreheads. He also tattooed tear lines under their eyes. The slave girls' tattoos took a long time to heal and festered, and Comyn, to prevent escape attempts from repeating, fixed shackles on the walls of the bunker. From now on, before going down into the basement, he signaled the slave girls with a lamp. After that, the captives had to fasten the shackles around their necks and arms, and then put the keys on the table. But one day Komyn was disappointed. He sent his assistant Tolpayeva to look for another slave, but she suddenly disappeared. So he decided to look for a new slave himself. In early 1996, Komyn brought to the garage 27-year-old Tatiana Nazimova. The girl suffered from mental illness and, having run away from home, roamed the railroad stations. She was not suitable for work, but Komyn made her his mistress and began to call her Oksana. By that time, the underground factory maniac moved to a new level. In addition to robes, his slave girls now sewed robes for priests, as well as weaving icons and coats of arms. The cloth with the coat of arms Komyn even tried to sell first to the local administration, and then he was not afraid to appeal with a similar proposal and to the leadership of the police Vyatsky Poliani. But everywhere he received a refusal, potential customers did not have money. Then, to increase income, Komyn decided to connect his slave girls to the cultivation of cucumbers in the greenhouse. He installed a greenhouse in the bunker, organized electric heating, and quite quickly received the first crop of vegetables. But soon the owner of a neighboring garage, in a conversation with Komyn, mentioned the unbearable heat, because of which even sprouted potatoes stored at his place. After that, the maniac decided not to risk it and dismantled the greenhouse. By the way, shadow earnings did not prevent Komyn from registering at the labor exchange and receiving unemployment benefits. In January 1997, Tolpayeva, a fugitive whom Komyn had accidentally bumped into on the street, returned to the bunker. He pretended to be happy to meet her and offered her former accomplice to return to the case. More than that, Komyn promised Tolpayeva to make her head of sales. Overjoyed by such prospects, the woman agreed, not even suspecting that Komyn planned to take revenge for her escape. However, according to other sources, the reason for the massacre of Tolpayeva could be her attempt to blackmail Komyn. She allegedly demanded a decent amount of money for silence about his dark deeds. Otherwise, the woman threatened to turn to the police. In any case, Tolpayeva faced a terrible death. Komyn tortured her for a long time, beat her, and put needles under her fingernails, and then ordered other captives to inject her with brake fluid. The frightened slave girls could not get into a vein, and then Tolpayeva offered to drink the poison herself. According to the memories of the captives, Vera died in agony for 15 hours. After her death, Komyn and Mikheyev threw her body into an ice hole on the Vyatka River. Komyn's next victim was his mistress Tatiana Nazimova. Her mental illness was joined by a physical one. She contracted leukemia, and by the end of a year of her life in the bunker, she could not get out of bed. By mid-March 1997, the maniac planned to get rid of Nazimova, but on her defense stood Tatiana Kozakova. She began to beg to release the sick slave, say because of her mental features that will not tell anyone anything. Komyn thought about it and decided to find out how adequately Nazimova assesses what is happening. She trustingly told the maniac that she was on a course of cutting and sewing, which is conducted by a teacher, Alexander Komin. After that, Nazimova's fate was decided. The maniac starved the victim for several days, and then forcibly poured a glass of antifreeze into her mouth through a funnel. The body of the deceased Komyn decided to load on a sled and drag under cover of night right under the doors of the local morgue. The idea that the staff of the institution will find the deceased right at the door amused the killer. However, Komyn never reached his destination. After spotting a passerby at the exit of the cooperative, he abandoned his burden and fled. At the end of 1996, a new prisoner appeared in Komen's bunker, 22-year-old Irina Ganyushkina, who had been brought in by Tolpeva shortly before her death. Ganyushkina tried to become an entrepreneur at the local market, but failed miserably. She lost a large sum of money she had borrowed. At the same time, Irina's personal life was going well. She was going to move in with her young man. On the fateful day, Ganyushkina went to look rented apartment, the owner of which was her neighbor in the house, Vera Tolpeva. Having heard the girl's story about her debts, Tolpeva suggested Ganyushkina to go to the garage to her acquaintance Comyn, promised that he would lend Irina the necessary amount of money. However, instead, drugged with vodka and clofulene, the girl found herself in the bunker. Soon, Comyn came there. "From here come out only forward feet," he informed the new slave. But the hope for salvation appeared at Irina when the accomplice of the maniac, Mikheyev, descended into the basement, his captive knew since childhood. Ganyushkina began to beg his acquaintance to help her, but he not only refused, but also raped the slave. Meanwhile, Ganyushkina, who had a pretty appearance and a docile character, took a great liking to Comyn. On March 8, 1997, the maniac, in an attempt to please the girl, brought treats to the bunker and organized a festive table for his captives. Sympathy maniac to Irina immediately noticed Kozakova. Waiting until Comyn leaves, she suggested Ganyushkina to be more affectionate with him, to put his vigilance to sleep. She obeyed her friend in misfortune and began to show signs of attention to Comyn, even dedicated poems to him. When she read them, he was in tears. Kozakova's plan succeeded. Comyn was fascinated by the new seamstress and began to ask Ganyushkina to bear him a child. The maniac even tried to artificially impregnate the prisoner with a syringe of his sperm. Ganyushkina listened with horror to Comyn's stories about his plans. He was going to create a slave farm underground, to gather women who would give birth and raise him slaves. After a while, the girl managed to convince the maniac that she could not bear a child in the bunker. In mid-April 1997, Comyn kicked out of his apartment on Lenin Street the previous cohabitant and settled there, Irina Ganyushkina. But he was not going to trust the girl, never let her out of the house alone, and even accompanied her to the toilet at night. Ganyushkina walked only accompanied by Comyn. One day they met the girl's parents in the street, and her tormentor immediately asked for their blessing for marriage. He introduced himself as an electrician working at the local hospital. Ganyushkina's mother and father gave their consent, not even realizing that at that moment there was a shiv in their daughter's side. Comyn was afraid that the girl would scream. After a while, Comyn forced Ganyushkina to take to himself 2-year-old Nastya, her daughter from a previous relationship. Irina quickly realized that the child will become a hostage, which will deprive her of chances to escape. But it turned out otherwise. On July 21, 1997, he allowed Irina alone to take the child to the pediatrician, and himself went on business. Shortly before that, the maniac told Ganyushkina that he had had enough of the slaves and was going to fill the bunker with earth along with the captives there. Irina realized that it was impossible to delay. "He just came out of the house. I packed, Nastya packed. He left me the money, and I ran to the bus stop. At first I was afraid. Maybe he wants to check me, somewhere standing there. Nothing, normal. Came to the police, began to tell, and no one believes me," Irina recalled. Ganyushkina insisted that she be escorted to the office of a familiar operative. To him, the woman began to list the names of all the captives, and immediately recognized the slaves on the photos under the glass on the table. Tolpayeva, Melnikova, and Kozakova were listed as missing. However, the guards were not looking for the women. Given the way of life of the missing, decided that they went on a bender. Soon, a task force arrived at Komens' garage. Ganyushkina warned the police that the ladder leading to the bunker is energized, so they decided to set up an ambush and wait for the owner of the garage. As soon as Komyn appeared, he was immediately rounded up by the police. He categorically denied that slave laborers were working in the bunker under the garage and kept silent about the fact that the stairs leading there were energized. Then one of the operatives told Komyn that he was about to go downstairs, and if he died, Alexander would be tried for the death of a police officer. The maniac immediately de-energized the stairs. The freed women were led out of the basement wearing dark blindfolds. Their eyes had become accustomed to daylight over the years of captivity. "We lived like in a grave," Komyn's slave women recalled. Soon his accomplice Mikiv was also detained. He began to justify himself. He said he had helped Komyn only because he had threatened to kill his wife and children. However, this did not save the maniac's accomplice from 20 years in prison. Mikiv served 18 of those years in Kirovo-Chapetsk penal colony number 11, IK11, and then moved to Moscow to live. As for Komyn, at his trial he demanded a public execution for himself, instead of which he received a life sentence. "I regret that Irinka and I did not get married. I did not marry her and did not finish all this," he lamented after the verdict. The 44-year-old maniac did not wait to be sent to the zone, and soon after the trial, he settled the score with his life in the detention center. It turned out that his last resting place, Komyn, found near the grave of the father of his victim, Tatiana Kozikova. However, the maniac himself envisioned the place of his final shelter somewhat differently. "An underground city," he said, "I will make that there will be a huge number of people. I will make myself a coffin with glass windows, and they, Komyn's children, will come and look at me. I'll pump the air out of the coffin, and I'll always be whole. I will plant an apple tree next to it as a symbol," he says, recalled his accomplice Mikiv about Komyn's crazy dreams. Irina Ganyushkina changed her name and left Vyatsky Polyny forever. Tatiana Melnikova and Tatiana Kozakova, who were released, were never able to adapt to normal life. At first, the women tried to look for work, but no one wanted to hire former slaves. Sometimes they had no choice but to eat the waste they found in garbage dumps. Both lived on the outside for a little over 7 years, after which they died of heart attacks.
Ах ты, как же ты ему поддалась, и как же ты попала.